Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast. When we last left Assyria, Esarhaddon had pulled off one of the biggest coups in all of ancient Middle Eastern history. He conquered Egypt, at least the north, and booted the Nubian dynasty back south into modern day Sudan. He was the first Middle Eastern king to rule Egypt since the Hyksos period, around a millennium prior, but within just a couple short years, he died en route to retaking Egypt after a revolt against Assyrian rule broke out. His death put into motion his oddball succession treaty, with his younger son Ashurbanipal becoming the senior king of the Assyrian Empire from Nineveh over his older brother Shamash-shum-ukin, who was confined to ruling over the hotbed of Babylon in the south. The lengthy, decades long reign of Ashurbanipal will set the stage for the destruction of the Assyrian Empire. And so, to take us through this rocky period, I am extraordinarily honored to welcome Dr. Eckart Frahm to the show. Dr. Frahm is the John M. Musser Professor of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Yale University, and his book, Assyria, The Rise and Fall of the World's First Empire, came to me tragically late in the writing of this show because ever since I picked it up, I have gone back to it time and time again. It's just a wonderfully readable book, and as soon as I tore through it, I knew I needed to get Eckart on the show. So without further ado, Eckart Fromm, welcome to the Ale House at the End of the World.
Thank you, Hayden. Pleasure to be here, and I have been quite impressed by what you have offered so far on ancient Assyria. Very well-informed show, and a lot of really significant stuff that you have been doing.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So, Dr. Fromm, why Assyria? What drew you into writing this wonderful book in particular?
The book was actually, I wrote the book because an agent contacted me and told me that he thought there wasn't a good sort of accessible book on Assyria. There were a couple of short introductions and some very specific studies, but nothing for a broader audience that would tell the story in a slightly more epic, but not too epic way. And I agreed. I thought that was correct. And Assyria, and especially Imperial Assyria, that is the last centuries of Assyrian history, they are very exciting. They are, first of all, important, I think, in terms of world history. I argue in my book, and you can see that from the title, that Assyria created the world's first empire during that time. And of course, empire has been with us ever since. So considering the origins of this geopolitical concept, I think is important. But apart from that, there's also a lot that is exciting, that is almost entertaining. You can trace the conflicts among the various Assyrian kings and princes, internal revolts, the wars that occur in great detail. There's just an enormous amount of evidence that we have, including pictorial evidence, many images from Assyrian wall reliefs that provide us with additional information. So it's really an embarrassment of riches, and I thought it would be great material for a book.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it turned out wonderfully. He wasn't the end. He's not our last king of Assyria, but there's almost no one more fitting for this kind of tale of, like you said, and entertaining history. As a climax, it's hard to do better than Ashurbanipal, our current subject. So, just to start with broad strokes, who is he? When did he reign, and why is he so famous?
Yeah, so Ashurbanipal was the Assyrian king who reigned from 669 BCE to probably 631 BCE. The date of his death is still not entirely certain, but most scholars agree that it was most likely in 631. That's a long time. That's nearly 40 years. It's a very extensive reign. A reign that marks in many ways the apex of Assyria's power and cultural significance. But at the same time also heralds the collapse, because especially during the last decade of Ashurbanipal's reign, things seem to be going wrong. And so his reign is important both when you want to look at how the Assyrian Empire worked during its heyday, and also when you want to understand why this state collapsed so quickly. It was a pretty dramatic event that the fall of the empire was a pretty dramatic event, not so much a process. But Ashurbanipal is also famous. Maybe famous is too much, but one of the few ancient Near Eastern kings who are known beyond the small circles of specialists for two other reasons. Namely, first, as I already indicated, Assyrian art, especially these bas reliefs, also starts with images of campaigns and hunts and things like that on the walls of Assyrian palaces. Some of the most beautiful images from ancient Assyria actually from the reign of Ashurbanipal. The quality, the artistic quality is just very, very impressive. And he's also famous as the founder of what one can arguably say was the world's first universal library. Ashurbanipal's famous library, one should specifically say, perhaps or more precisely say, libraries, because there were several of them in Nineveh, on the Citadel Mount, in two of the palaces there, and in two temples. Ashurbanipal was a great patron not only of the arts but also of scholarship and writing, and he's associated with this specific effort of creating this library. There was actually a blockbuster exhibition on Ashurbanipal, I think in 2018 at the British Museum. It was the only such exhibition ever dedicated to an ancient Near Eastern king, and there's a reason for that. Ashurbanipal is a really, really interesting, fascinating, and historically important character.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something we'll get into at the end, but again, it's very fitting. He lives and dies. The empire is at its like apex with him, and then it collapses. A couple decades within the next few decades. Um, and yet he has, because perhaps it was such a significant event, he has this afterlife as this literary character who we would kind of see analogs in with like Cleopatra and other figures who have hung so heavily over popular culture, Julius Caesar. And a lot of people don't know about it. And I thought that was such an interesting element of your book, but that will be, I guess, a teaser for the latter part of the episode in the kind of afterlives of Ashurbanipal. So, starting out with his early reign, what were they like when it comes to foreign policy? Because obviously, we sort of leave Esarhaddon on this cliffhanger. He dies literally trying to get back to Egypt to retake it as revolts have spread out. How are things going for Ashurbanipal when he heads out to quell those revolts?
So initially they go quite well, I would say. I should perhaps add that Ashurbanipal was not, it seems, originally destined to become the new Syrian king. He was actually, in all likelihood, not the eldest son, but rather the fourth eldest. But, well, the earlier born sons either died or disappeared from the scene for other reasons, not quite clear. And one of his elder brothers was eventually destined by his father Esarhaddon to become king of Babylon rather than king of Assyria. And so Ashurbanipal was at some point selected by Esarhaddon, by his father, to be his successor. And that could have led to unhappiness, as was the case with his father and predecessor Esarhaddon himself, who, when he became king as a younger son, had to cope with a lot of opposition. That doesn't seem to have been the situation with Ashurbanipal. I mean, the people in Assyria had to swear oaths of allegiances again that were actually, interestingly enough, administered by Ashurbanipal's grandmother, Nakia, a very influential royal woman, who prompted all major Assyrians, especially, of course, the members of the elites, but also members of Ashurbanipal's family, to swear their allegiance to Ashurbanipal. And it seems that during the first couple of decades of Ashurbanipal's reign, there wasn't really massive opposition to him, which enabled him to engage in foreign policy that was first quite successful. You mentioned Egypt, and you're right. After Esarhaddon had conquered Egypt in 671 BCE, which of course was a major moment in the history of the ancient Near East, Western Asia, and North Eastern Africa. The Egyptians were not happy and they revolted. In 669, Esarhaddon died on his way to Egypt when he tried to quell one of these rebellions. But Ashurbanipal went back and was more successful, initially at least. In 667, it seems he sent his troops to Egypt, and they won a major battle in the city of Memphis and re-implemented Assyrian rule there. What the Assyrians were not able to do was really consolidate their power there, because shortly thereafter there was yet another revolt. You mentioned the Kushite dynasty, the Nubian dynasty from the south, which initially was represented by a king named Taharka. He's known from the Bible as Tirhaka, appears in 2 Kings 18 and 19. He had been defeated by Ashurbanipal and had eventually died, but his son and successor, Tanudamun, remained opposed to Assyrian rule. And so Ashurbanipal, probably at some point between 666 and 663, actually had to send his troops yet again to Egypt. This time they made it as far as Thebes, the great massive capital of Upper Egypt, known, I think, to everyone for its gigantic temples and the tombs and the Valley of Kings, etc.
You will always come back to the Karnak Temple at some point,
Indeed,
and
yes. And
if yeah,
Ashurbanipal actually, or rather his troops did go there, and among other things, it's quite interesting that they took a lot of booty from there, including two massive obelisk made of precious metal. That's not exactly clear what it was. It's called Akkadian Zahalu, which is some of electron or silver or whatever it was. But at any rate, he brought that back to Assyria and Babylonia and used that metal to create ornaments for the god Marduk in Babylon and for Assyrian deities, etc. And it was just part of this booty that he received. So the conquest of Thebes by the Assyrians, probably actually referenced in the biblical book of Nahum, was of course one of the great triumphs of Assyrian imperial rule altogether. So in this very moment, you could really say Assyria's predominance and hegemony must have been felt all over the place, and it must have been extremely difficult to imagine that just some 50 years later everything would be over as it would be. So this is when Ashurbanipal really experienced some great military triumphs, and he was also successful on some other western fronts. He had to deal with Tyre, which was on an island, very hard to conquer, but he managed to force the ruler of Tyre and the ruling assembly to sign a treaty with him and fundamentally accept Assyrian hegemony, at least for some time. He
and this
also,
was again very significant because, as we've seen repeatedly throughout this history, the Phoenician coast, I mean, they survived outside of Ugarit, the Bronze Age collapse. They are so well protected as these kind of crucial trading posts that they seem to get decent treatment, and they're obviously people who have a cultural history of like being savvy political operators and knowing how to avoid some of the tougher parts of existing at the time. So it's pretty impressive, frankly, that he managed to break through that to conquer Tyre.
yeah, absolutely. And I mean, he didn't fully conquer it, but he
Mm,
did manage to
a
subjugate
fair
it. And
point.
I mean, you're absolutely right about, of course, Tyre and the Phoenicians in general being very important economic players in the eastern, also in the western Mediterranean. And here you can actually see that the Assyrians were just not just these violent conquerors who would basically destroy every place that they would occupy. They were quite savvy in using those whom they had brought into their orbit, their political orbit, for the greater good of enhancing their wealth. So in the case of the Phoenicians, they were happy to let them trade and continue to send their ships out into the Mediterranean. They would just siphon off some of their wealth through taxation and tribute, which was very much in their interest. It has actually been even argued that some of the Western expansion by the Phoenicians, starting in the 9th century already, was in response to these Assyrian attempts to extract a
to
lot
to
of this
to get
wealth.
better outposts and
Exactly,
connection.
better outposts, etc.
And
Yeah.
and again, that again is really interesting in kind of the knock-on effects that it has, because we were just talking about the episode I just released yesterday was about the what seems to have been a Phoenician originated child sacrifice cult, the Molchrites, that get rewritten as Moloch in the Bible. And so this again, it's very interesting, the different responses to empire and how that ends up having these kind of knock-on effects, and kind of who ends up being culturally more significant in the case of Carthage and these other Punic sites. These are trading outposts in places like Sardinia and Sicily and throughout the Mediterranean. it is fascinating to think of them kind of as a response to empire, and what the effects have. You know, Carthage ends up becoming Rome's greatest enemy for a while. But it that is why all of this history just kind of blows my mind. And I will also say something I was thinking about is that when you argue that Assyria is the first empire, something you could add to your list is that they took obelisks from Egypt, and I think all of the great empires throughout Western empires throughout history, you do have to steal an obelisk from Egypt, I think, to make it into the big boys club. And as far as I know, they might have been some of the first to do that.
It's a great argument. I'll keep that in mind, and then if I do another edition, I'll add that. I hadn't thought about it, but you're right. No, and it's certainly true. I mean, you have these things standing in Italy because the Romans took them. You have them standing in France because under Napoleon,
Yep.
were taken, and you have them standing in New York. So the contemporary empires, in quotation marks, have them as well. Yeah, so yes, obelisks were extremely attractive, apparently, for anyone who would go to Egypt.
Going on 2,500 years of doing that. It's
Yeah, no,
really
no. There's
something.
actually a book on that. I don't remember the author at this point. I do reference in the footnote in my book, but that deals with this question of stealing obelisks over time and through the ages. It's a great topic. Yeah, I agree.
Right. So now that we've dealt with kind of the West, how is Ashurbanipal doing in the East? Because you've got, I know we've got the everything from the Zagros Mountains into kind of east of the Persian Gulf and like that area, and then you also have Saudi or Arabia, not Saudi Arabia, Arabia to the south. How is he doing with managing that situation?
Yeah, so I should perhaps first quickly say that he is initially also quite successful in dealing with the north and the
Mm,
south. You mentioned the Arabs. Um, Even though with the fights against the Arabs, he constantly claims in his many royal inscriptions that he defeats them, but then they raise their heads yet again, and you can see that those defeats were actually rather uh, insignificant. The problem with the Arabs is that they move around, and it's very hard for a sedentary empire like Assyria to really get full control of this area, and so the Assyrians never do. In the north, one target of Assyrian interest is the Lydians. There's a famous story of King Gyges, who's known from Plato and Herodotus and the Greek sources, and the ring and all that stuff, that he sends an embassy to Nineveh, to Ashurbanipal, claiming that he, Gyges, had seen in a dream the god Ashur asking him to submit to Ashurbanipal, so the Assyrians would help him against the Cimmerians. And that is how Ashurbanipal claims, at least, how he also got a foothold in Western Asia. In the East, you asked about the East. In the East, the situation is not quite so easy, though. In the East, there's one important opponent of Assyrian rule, and that is the Elamites, the land of Elam. Um, and at that time, it's essentially not just one state, but there are a number of polities. The most important one is the one ruled from the city of Susa. Um, but there are others, and the Assyrians and the Elamites have historically been enemies for quite a long time. Under Asahadon, Ashurbanipal's father, the relationship actually gets a little bit better, and there's a treaty, and the Assyrians at some point even send food aid to Elam when there is a famine. So Ashurbanipal is all the more distraught when, nonetheless, that's of course always from his perspective. The Elamite perspective is far less well attested, so we have to take that with a grain of salt. But he's very distraught when he claims the Elamites, despite all that aid the Assyrians have provided, rebel again. And then there are a number of altercations. The Elamites at some point even seek to attack Babylon, to which we will get, I think, in a moment, which of course plays an important role in the story of Ashurbanipal. And then in 653, so that's a few years after Ashurbanipal has become king, and a king by the name of Teoman, they even start apparently a campaign aimed at taking the Assyrian core areas. So Ashurbanipal claims they wanted to conquer Nineveh. But that doesn't happen. An army is being sent again to Elam, and the Elamite troops are pushed back on the river Ulai, the modern Karawan River in southwestern Iran. The Assyrians have a major victory, and Elam is essentially very much weakened at this point. The Elamite king, Teoman, he is beheaded on the scene. His head has been sent to Nineveh and then paraded around in kind of choreography of terror of a kind that Ashurbanipal was very fond of in ways that I feel are, from the psychological point of view, rather problematic.
Yeah.
When you look at a famous relief showing Ashurbanipal banqueting with his wife in a beautiful garden, you first think this is a scene that is completely idyllic and private. But there you have a head of an enemy when you look closely, hanging from a nearby tree, and it has usually been assumed by scholars up to recent times that this is the head of this very Teoman, who had once claimed, according to Ashurbanipal, that he would not be quiet until he would sit and dine in Nineveh. So here he now actually is present at a banquet at Nineveh, but only in the form of his head hanging from the tree. It must be said that this kind of nice and neat story has recently been questioned by an Israeli scholar who argues that it is not the head of Teoman, but rather of a Babylonian enemy of Ashurbanipal. There's no label here, so it may not be quite exactly like that, but we do know that the head of Teoman was paraded around in Nineveh, and that this was the outcome of this very campaign.
At the very least, it's a generic replacement for the kind of treatment that this
Yes,
king from Iran almost certainly received.
yeah,
Um,
indeed, yes.
does he end up destroying Elam? I can never remember. Is it before or after everything starts to go to hell with his brother? I think it's
Yeah,
after, right?
it happens after, and
Yeah.
you're right in alluding to this perhaps most charged conflict in all of Ashurbanipal's reign, the altercation with his brother in Babylon.
Yeah, so I guess to set you up for that, throughout our history, our political histories, this is not a super uncommon thing to do. Maybe perhaps putting the younger in charge is an exception. But having two of your sons rule over various parts of an expanding empire is certainly not unheard of. I think it happens in Thailand and results in chaos. It like I think it's one of the first things that happens in Rome after they get over the oh well, we're not technically passing along the Caesarship to the biological heir. Well, they start kind of ripping that off in I think the 70s CE with Titus. I think is one of the first ones. And again, it kind of immediately, as soon as you do that, you have multiple sons, you have to deal with the fallout of that and kind of the intrapersonal politics that come along with that, in addition to the actual like social and economic politics. You've also got this kind of familial relationship that can have its own dynamics that are themselves sometimes petty, and sometimes ridiculous. So the honeymoon period does not last forever between Ashurbanipal and Shamash Shumukin. Do we know what that kind of how that progresses over this first decade or so of Ashurbanipal's reign?
Yeah, so just perhaps to pave the way towards that. In general, of course, since the mid 8th century BCE, the Assyrians would often annex areas that they had conquered and turn them into provinces. So when they conquered
Samaria, for example.
Samaria, exactly the northern kingdom of Israel, that is being split up into 3 Assyrian provinces, and in those provinces, you would have a provincial governor. Often that would have been a eunuch who reports directly to the king, who has, well, a number of officials working for him. And this is how Assyrian empire is actually organized. But the way Assyria deals with its sort of southern sibling civilization, Babylonia, things are always different. The Assyrians always considered Babylonia to be special. They were quite aware of the fact that they had drawn extensively on Babylonian culture for their own cultural and religious institutions. So many of the Assyrian deities worshipped in Assyria were actually imported in a way from the south. The big exception, of course, is the Assyrian god Ashur, a genuinely Assyrian deity, very closely associated with Assyria's religious capital of of Ashur, same name as the god. But also in terms, for instance, of literature, you talked about the library that Ashurbanipal actually imported tons and tons of clay tablets inscribed with literary and scholarly texts from the south, from Babylonia. And the relationship between Assyria and Babylonia is very much similar to the relationship between Rome and Greece. Where again, you have a slightly later civilization, culturally indebted to an earlier one, but politically and militarily superior. This is basically the situation. And the Assyrians are willing to leave Babylonia a certain degree of formal independence, so it can stay a kingdom, given that respect they have for its culture, provided that the Babylonians do not fundamentally question Assyria's claim for hegemony. The problem is this doesn't really work very well throughout the centuries. So whenever there is an attempt by the Assyrians to make someone a vassal king in Babylon, that very vassal king at some point will rebel. And on other occasions, Assyrian princes became king of Babylon and were delivered to the Elamites, and so on and so forth. There were various experiments with that. So Esarhaddon, you mentioned that already, tried yet another experiment. He made one of his sons, Ashurbanipal's elder brother Shamash-shum-ukin, king of Babylon, and he made Ashurbanipal king of Assyria. This brother of Ashurbanipal, Shamash-shum-ukin, was not supposed to have a lot of political and military power, but he was supposed to be fundamentally in charge of the temples in Babylon, of the intellectual life there, of the rituals, of the cult, and of all these things. The problem, the long-term problem, was that Ashurbanipal himself was so fond of literature and culture and all these things. So rather than just simply accept that this Shamash-shum-ukin, his brother, would perhaps be politically impotent, but would have some say and sort of predominate this area of religion and the cult and literature, Ashurbanipal constantly interfered. So rather than leave Shamash-shum-ukin deal with the building of temples in Babylon, it was Ashurbanipal who did it. He communicated with the scribes and scholars all over the place in Babylonia. And at some point, it seems, and we can't really see what triggered this in the end, but at some point, it seems that his brother Shamash-shum-ukin, the king of Babylon, just simply had enough. And so in the year 652 BCE, Shamash-shum-ukin initiates a rebellion against his brothers. It's essentially a war between brothers. And it is a war between these sibling civilizations of Babylonia and Assyria. So it's almost really like a civil war, and civil wars can sometimes be particularly charged, they're often particularly bloody. And that is indeed the case here. This is a war that lasts for 4 years. Shamash-shum-ukin alone could never have won it, but he manages to get a lot of support, including support from the Elamites, whom you just mentioned, but also from Arabs, Arameans, people from the so-called Sealand in the south of what is now the modern Republic of Iraq, and so on. And for the first 2 years, the various cities in Babylon, they change possession all the time. It's a very, very volatile situation. But in 650, the situation begins to shift to Ashurbanipal's advantage. He puts a siege on Babylon, and 2 years later, in 648, he conquers Babylon. And this is a particularly terrible period we read in Ashurbanipal's inscriptions, but also in some economic documents. It's not just literature, but it seems to really have happened how the people in Babylon are desperate, how they have nothing to eat anymore. They start eating the flesh of their sons and daughters. Ashurbanipal puts this in these inscriptions. That is probably hyperbolical, but there may have been incidents of cannibalism. People are clearly starving. At the end, Shamash-shum-ukin dies in the conflagration. We don't really know if he committed suicide or was killed by the Assyrians or what happened, but he dies in the conflagration. His palace goes up in flames, and Ashurbanipal takes over Babylonia and actually puts on the throne there a king named Kandalanu, who's so insignificant in the coming decades that some scholars have even thought he was just kind of metal standard placed there in order to represent the king. But in fact, it is now Ashurbanipal who also sort of factually really calls the shots. So this is a moment of great trauma for the Babylonians, and that's important to remember when you think about the end of the Assyrian Empire, where the Babylonians, of course, play an important role. So at some point, they will have their revenge.
I think this kind of, it is very fascinating. I was just reading a book from Karl von der Thorn on the Elephantine community of Jews in southern Egypt, and basically these seem to have been a group of mercenaries, like mercenaries from, I think some of them were from Babylonia, some of them were from Hamat, and some of them were from Samaria. They initially get run out of their own cities during, I think, Sennacherib or maybe Sargon II's kind of campaigns during the destruction of Samaria, and kind of that late 8th century uh, machine that is Assyria just swallowing everything in its path. And then some of them during the subsequent conquests and campaigns end up like they end up meeting and creating community around desert oasis, probably in Palmyra, and then that also kind of starts to collapse, and so they flee all the way to Egypt because these things just keep happening over and over again. And Babylonia, or Babylon specifically, the city, has kind of gone through that just over this a couple of generations. They've been attacked over and over again. They were destroyed earlier in the century, or late in the 8th century, and rebuilt um, by Esarhaddon in large part. Like this, it was a big thing, and then it gets burned down again by Esarhaddon's own sons, and their kind of politicking. And I think that like you're saying, the weight of this kind of very recent history plays a pretty significant role in what happens next, and what happens when perhaps there's, people are able to keep challenging the might of the Assyrian Empire and the might of Nineveh. Um,
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think that's all correct. Yeah.
so this all kind of rolls into like, how did the put down of his brother's revolt impact Ashurbanipal and his approach to imperial rule from there?
Yeah, I mean, most likely, ever since he had experienced this act of treason as he saw it, of course, Shamash Shamakin would have had a very different perspective. He would have become even more, well, misanthropic and restrained and worried about not being able to trust anyone. I think that is something that characterizes his reign from this moment onwards. At least you can see it in the fact that it's clear that in the later parts of his reign he relies ever more on eunuchs, so people who have no family of their own, to whom they owe loyalty and who are completely devoted to the king. That seems to be something that's happening. And another thing is Ashurbanipal has always been very reluctant to engage in warfare on his own. I mentioned the campaign against Elam in 653, and we see there quite clearly in later inscriptions, he says that he himself went to with his troops to Elam, and even claims that uses the first person singular, that he himself cut off the head of Teoman and things like that. But the very first inscription that describes this campaign includes a really interesting episode in which he reports that prior to the campaign, a seer in Assyria had seen a dream. The goddess Ishtar, a very powerful goddess of love and war, worshipped in Assyria, that the seer had seen her appear to him in this dream, and the goddess had told him that, speaking so to Ashurbanipal, you don't have to go to war, eat, drink, and make merry, stay in your palace, everything will be fine, I will take care of things. And so he doesn't go. He actually stays at home in his palace and sends his troops, and that seems to have been his modus operandi from early onwards. And now you could say a king doesn't have to be on the forefront of his troops. It would actually be unwise. It is quite clear that you better protect him. But certain kings used to join their troops on campaigns, and they would be sitting on some hill and watching over the whole thing when an actual pitched battle was fought. But with Ashurbanipal, you have a situation where he would not go at all.
Right. I mean, and that seems to have been sliding for some time now as the empire sort of feels itself. And I think it was it Esarhaddon who
Yeah,
remotely
that's
hung out
one.
at the Temple of Sin. Like he at least left the city, though, right? He didn't stay
He
in
did.
Nineveh.
I mean,
He at least
you
made
can.
it a little far west.
Asahadon was also afraid of rebellions, and with good reasons, because there were
Yeah.
actually quite a few rebellions, internal ones, insurrections against him at home in all important Assyrian cities, Nineveh, Haran, Ashur. In 671, they are all quelled. Ashur didn't really have, as far as we know, to deal with this to the same extent, but he seems to have inherited from his father this fear of exposing himself. And as you say, I mean, Esarhaddon, despite the paranoia he might have felt, he was also very sickly. I mean, he died on his way to Egypt, so he
Right.
did go to some accompany his troops at some point. And Ashurbanipal really seems not to have done that very much. Anyway, I mean, in the 640s, we still have a lot of inscriptions from him describing military action. And again, Elam is actually on the forefront now. The Assyrians, you mentioned the destruction, the war against Elam, that actually experiences its apex only after the taking of Babylon 648 and 647, 646. The Assyrians eventually invade Elam, conquer the city of Susa, the capital, and destroy it entirely. And there's again sort of an orgy of destruction, and they even dig out the bones of former Elamite kings and bring them to Nineveh and things like that. They want to really destroy the memory of that the Elamites have of their own history, of their own rulers. They want to completely eliminate this. It's a very gruesome story, even worse in a way than what happens in Babylon. And there are additional campaigns also against the Arabs. And it almost seems as though then in the 640s, you have a situation where Assyria's major enemies are defeated. Babylon is no longer a center of resistance. Shamash Shamash is dead. The Elamites are gone. It looks as though in Urartu in the north, it's another of Assyria's traditional rivals, mounted warriors. The Cimmerians and later the Scythians have posed a great challenge to that kingdom, have probably destroyed much of it. So it looks as though Assyria is without any competitors. But what has also happened is that, of course, by destroying especially the land of Elam, the Assyrians have, well, done away with a polity that protected them from another state, another polity, the Confederation of the Medes, that would now, of course, with the Elamites no longer being between them and the Assyrians, suddenly emerge as very, very powerful rivals of Assyria, and that brings us eventually to the fall of the empire. But there is a
Yeah.
price to pay for these putative victories, and in some ways they're Pyrrhus victories.
Yeah, absolutely. It's one of those things where sometimes when you're reading a lot of this history, it's easy to forget that civilization extends beyond the borders of kind of these regional polities that we often deal with because of their written records. And it seems Assyria may have, or at least Ashurbanipal may have, felt much the same way because he destroys Susa, and whether he knew it or not, he was creating a power vacuum that someone would come in to fill. And he probably assumed that it could be him, that it could be Assyria. It never really was, though, which is, again, it's very interesting because they are much closer to Nineveh than Egypt is. And yet, like, the amount of as far as I know, and I guess maybe this is just a speculative question, when they go into Egypt and take it over, they install all of the accoutrement of imperial rule and all of the kind of everything. They focus a lot on the roads that they need. They put a lot of administrators in. They devote a lot of people to ensuring that Egypt is ruled well, is taxed well, and everything comes back in a steady flow of goods and rewards for empire. Do they put that kind of attention on the East, or is it just not wealthy enough for them to consider? Like, is that administrative apparatus extend towards Elam and towards into Iran?
It's a good point. In some respects, Egypt and Elam are treated similarly, namely in they not becoming provinces. Instead, in both Egypt and Elam, what Ashurbanipal does is that he tries to identify local rulers, the petty rulers of the of some of the cities in Lower Egypt, or members of the royal family in Elam who he believes might be amenable to a more pro-Assyrian perspective, and he puts them into positions of power. So in Egypt, for instance, there is first a guy by the name of Necho, and then his son Psamtik, who is the ruler of the city of Sais. Now in Egypt, these Egyptian rulers get Assyrian names. So Psamtik is called Nabu Shezibani, it's an Assyrian name, in the hope that they would fully adopt this Assyrian identity and would remain faithful vassals of Assyria, basically. And that doesn't work. Psamtik at some point just simply realizes the Assyrians do not have enough troops in Egypt, and Egypt, of course, is a big place, a lot of people, and so we don't know how exactly it happens, but in the later 660s and then certainly the 650s, the Assyrians lose control, and Psamtik becomes the founder of a new dynasty, the 26th dynasty that rules from the city of Sais in northern Egypt. In Elam too, there are these local rulers, and there are lots of them. And when you read Ashurbanipal's inscriptions, it's very confusing to read about Elam because you have lots and lots of very strange names like Ortaki, Teoman, Umanaldash, and so on. And some of these are spending some time as hostages at Nineveh and actually hobnobbing with Ashurbanipal, the king, and so going on lion hunts with him or engaging in shooting competitions. This seems quite harmonious. And so there's an attempt made to re-educate them Assyrian style, and they are sent back to Elam. But there too, in the end, this attempt to produce loyal vassal rulers that you can then implement fail. These attempts are never really terribly successful. The Elamite rulers usually also simply at some point, and probably also because they are pressured by their own people, they just defect. And that happens in Elam again and again. In Elam, the amount of destruction is just much more pronounced than in Egypt. In Egypt, probably there wasn't that much destruction. I would imagine that the Assyrians took Thebes without much fighting, and then they take away a lot of precious stuff, including those obelisks. And that's it. In Elam, there's really a sustained attempt at destroying the major palaces and especially also the temples. Even divine statues of kings are mutilated, their noses are cut off, their ears are cut off. That's all described in great detail in the Assyrian in the royal inscriptions. There's an amount of hatred involved here that you cannot find in Egypt. So this has to do with the history. Elam has always interfered, especially with Assyria's attempts to control Babylonia. The Elamites have always tried to stir up opponents of Assyria there. In Egypt, of course, it's a fairly new experience in the first place. This is only in 674 that the Assyrians for the first time try to conquer. At 671, they succeed. There never is this amount of hatred. Never is this kind of destruction that is wrought over Elam. So that's a big difference.
And Elam, as far as I know, doesn't have the kind of cultural cachet and prestige of a Babylon or of
Yes.
an Egypt. And so they kind of lose that potential respect for their culture and instead are treated to the kind of raw face of the Assyrian Empire and kind of the way that they handle it. So
Yeah, that's a good and interesting point. Babylonia in this regard is clearly most important, but interestingly, Egyptian magicians, physicians, scholars also play a certain role once Egypt has been conquered at the Assyrian court. So the Assyrian kings were usually really very much focused on cuneiform culture, accept Egypt as a sort of ancient civilization that has to offer a lot in cultural terms, a lot of cultural capital. Whereas with Elam, that's not the case to the same extent. I mean, again, the Assyrian kings find the Elamite princes appealing enough to engage in these sports-like competitions with them when they are at Nineveh as hostages. But Elamite religion and culture, it plays a certain role. Occasionally, you've mentioned of Elamite deities also in Assyrian sources, and they are being endorsed somehow, but not in any sustained way.
so that gets us into kind of the domestic front. So this is, it's so interesting. Ashurbanipal does not live to see the fallout from a lot of these decisions. So we can. I mean, we'll talk a little bit at the end during the afterlives portion. But while this is all going on in the midst of this, he also kind of is cementing what we would consider his reputation. He has some of these eccentricities. There are kind of two that we can talk about. The first is obviously, famously, he's the world's great librarian, the first librarian for some, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, let's talk about what you've mentioned a couple times so far. He takes this, despite not going on campaign, he does take his military prowess seemingly very seriously. But it almost feels like, I don't know, professional wrestling levels to me, because he goes on these mock lion hunts and does some of this kind of sporting stuff that is a simulacrum of the real actual campaigning and fighting. Can you talk a bit about Ashurbanipal's self-styling as this warrior?
Yeah. So of course, it's always precarious to psychoanalyze any personality from the past. But if you were to try that with Ashurbanipal, you could argue that he overcompensates here. I mean, he clearly isn't going on these campaigns. I mean, and yet he claims he does. This is a disconnect that some people, of course, would have been aware of that might have damaged his reputation. So what does he do instead? I mentioned already that he is particularly engaged when it comes to torturing enemies have been taken captive and brought to Nineveh. Not that he is the first king to do that. I mean, this has happened before. There have been triumphs where prisoners of war are paraded around Nineveh and also tortured. But the way Ashurbanipal describes this, his inscriptions, the amount of detail that he provides, how his enemies are being humiliated by having to care to draw his chariots and serve him food, or the terrible stories about how sons have to grind the bones of their fathers, how Elamite emissaries have to lick the door sills in front of his throne room. That is on a level that is actually rather, off-putting, perhaps you could say. And then, yes, I wouldn't say, you mentioned these lion hunts. I wouldn't say these were mock hunting. I do think that Ashurbanipal actually went on hunts. So there are two types of hunting expeditions or activities you can distinguish. On one hand, you have the hunting in the countryside. He explains it, and here you see sort of the king who protects his people. So very nice. That lions, he claims, in Assyria have become numerous and have been pestering travelers and farmers. And these were lions that were a little smaller than African lions or so, but still a real threat. And so Ashurbanipal goes on hunting expeditions, and he depicts those hunting expeditions on some of his reliefs on these wall orthostats, stone orthostats that line the walls of his palaces in Nineveh, especially the North Palace. And these are some of the most attractive and beautiful reliefs, especially when it comes to the depiction of those lions who, in their death throes, because they're depicted in a very naturalistic way. So you can see the suffering that they endure. Which you cannot see when you look at also some of these reliefs showing the torture of enemies. And there's a certain lifelessness to the facial expressions of those.
It is shocking. I think you may mention it in one of Sennacherib's inscriptions. Like, so many of the people are portrayed, like you said, in kind of generic terms with no attention to their features, and then you'll occasionally just see someone who is depicted sometimes looking towards you, sometimes in like, they're typically in not relief, portrait, but anyway, sometimes they're looking directly at you, and it can be kind of affecting to see that in the midst of all of this kind of very generalized depiction of slaughter and killing. So
Yeah, no, that's right. But with the lions, it's very pronounced.
yeah.
So you have those hunts in the countryside, and then you also have Ashurbanipal kind of creating a kind of arena-like space within the city limits of Nineveh, so with dogs and soldiers marking off a space into which lions are led through a small gate. They have been caged, and you can see on some of those reliefs that depict this localized hunt, how Ashurbanipal, mounted on a horse, then kills altogether 18 lions within this constricted space, while people on a hill, on a nearby hill, watch this and can see their king engage in this activity. So clearly here an attempt to showcase himself as a very courageous, impressive, fearless man. reenacting, if you wish, the depiction shown on the Assyrian royal scene, which shows the Assyrian king approaching a rampant lion and killing that lion with a sword. Now, if you were to do that in reality, of course, so the lion standing on his hind legs and you approaching it and putting a sword into his belly, that would not be a good idea. And this is how Ashurbanipal depicts himself on many of these images. And we have to assume this isn't how it was. I mean, he clearly presents himself here in a way that is again hyperbolical. I mean, I'm sure that he did engage in some of these hunting activities, but the lions were probably sedated or certainly well fed prior to this, at least in the case of the hunt within Nineveh. The danger for the king must have been limited, and it's not feasible that he would have really approached the lions of just standing opposite of them. And
Yeah, you
so we
you
have
do
to
think
assume,
of kind of the elements of Roman gladiatorial fights, and
indeed,
like
yeah.
Commodus as an example
Mhm.
of an emperor who
Yes, I
steps
mean,
into the ring. It very
yes,
much fits into that
yeah.
kind of mold.
Commodus is a good example of that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, well, that's so fascinating. So this is one element of how he kind of puffs himself up, and but probably the more famous one is himself as a great scholar. So you mentioned that he sends people far and wide to get their hands on any piece of writing that he can to bring it back to his own personal collection, and sometimes it doesn't seem to have been a particularly voluntary process. Can you talk a bit about his collection?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we modern archaeologists who study ancient Assyrian and Babylonian texts have to be unbelievably grateful for him, because the libraries he assembled at Nineveh when they were uncovered in the mid 19th century still, even today, represent probably the most important repository, especially of a literary, scholarly, and religious texts from the ancient Near East. There were some 30,000 tablets and fragments that were found at Nineveh. That's a huge number, and obviously, I mean, anything from the Gilgamesh epic, from great hymns and epics to humorous literature. We included also some entertaining stuff. The library, lots and lots of omen texts, descriptions of rituals. Hardly anything you could not imagine. I
I
mean,
mean, this show would not exist without Ashurbanipal's library
yes,
in some ways, which is,
absolutely,
I mean,
yes,
that's we
yeah,
would not have the context we have
no.
for the biblical corpus
Mhm.
without Ashurbanipal.
Yes, Ashurbanipal's library remains really very, very significant to us. So, and as you rightly pointed out, in his first years, he of course got many of these texts again from Babylonia. There were also Syrian scholars who would provide him with texts, but Babylonia was really, really significant in this regard. So he would write to scholars in Babylonia, in Babylon, and Borsippa, and other places, and would ask them to send him original tablets. Those scholars would usually be screwed enough not to send the king their well, very valuable originals, but they would create copies on clay tablets and send those to Nineveh, where often Assyrian scribes would then copy them in the Assyrian script, which is more regular, easier to read. It would also be good for the king, of course. And this is how they would then be deposited with subscripts that would say this is a tablet from the library of Ashurbanipal, and often Ashurbanipal would be described in these texts as a very, very erudite scholar. Later on, after 648, after the defeat of Shamash-shum-Kin, he would also, it seems, actually see such tablets in Babylonia as war booty. So there would be book napping, if you wish. Initially, he may even have paid for it. We don't be absolutely sure about that, but there are some later letters or letters and later copies where he actually pays the Babylonian scholars for sending him these texts. At any rate, he does receive these tablets, and these libraries are being created, and his interest in the scribal arts goes back to his early youth. As I mentioned, he was not originally destined to become a Syrian king. Instead, he was apparently educated as a scholar, and at least to some extent learned some cuneiform. This is what he also says in a very interesting text, kind of an autobiography, an autobiographical sketch about his youth, which is something we otherwise hardly ever find in the cuneiform record. And then he says that even before he became king, he was able to read difficult inscriptions in Sumerian and Akkadian, even on stones from before the flood, and so on and so forth. I would study the penultimate tablet of a very learned series liver divination, called "If the Liver is a Mirror of Heaven," the most esoteric stuff you can imagine. So very, very proudly showcasing here again, in this case, not his military prowess, but rather his scholarly and scribal competency.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was mentioning it to you before we started recording. The astrophysicist Angela Collier has done a video, which I'll link in the comments, about kind of that I find a little bit analogous about how like modern day billionaires can sometimes portray themselves as like physicists or as understanding quantum physics and stuff like that. Like you've got Travis Kalanick from Uber, formerly of Uber, portraying himself. He's like, well, I've been talking to AI and I can talk about the edges of like what we know in the quantum world. And there's this kind of very there's this very inflated sense of their own erudition. I guess the question is, did Ashurbanipal have the stuff? Was he actually able to contend with the great thinkers of his time, or was he kind of one of these more modern style pretenders?
Well, it's quite clear that he was not quite as good as he claimed. He clearly was interested. He clearly was devoted. There's no question. Otherwise, this library wouldn't exist. I do think that he was able to read a lot of this material in some way. It's interesting that there are also many commentaries, ancient commentaries in the library, which may have served him to better understand, especially some of the Omen texts and so on. So this cannot be questioned. His ability to actively produce cuneiform text was more limited. We how do we know it? We have at least one tablet that he wrote. He wrote it to his father, so it's the end of his father Asarhaddon's reign, and this is a letter. And as has been established by a British scholar, Alistair Livingstone, when you look at the signs, they're actually quite crudely formed. So this is not really a great exercise in calligraphy. So this is one instance where we see limitations of his scribal competence. And what is also quite interesting is we have a number of letters that he exchanged with some of his teachers. One teacher in particular, a man by the name of Balasi. So he was probably still fairly young when he did so. But what you can see is that these teachers, in their own letters they sent him, would, for instance, provide pronunciation glosses for word signs that an average scribe would just know almost without any problem. So the sign for the word month, et, the Balasi gives a pronunciation gloss and says it's we pronounce as ohu, which is the word for month in Syrian, and that's something Ashurbanipal should have actually known had he really been deeply. Or you could say, well, this man was to become king. He had a lot of other things on his plate, and that's absolutely correct. But as you point out, I mean, the problem perhaps here is that earlier kings would also claim all sorts of great things for themselves, but they wouldn't put these alleged abilities to a series of public tests. And that is perhaps the problem with Ashurbanipal, that he did that. He thought he could really, really do this properly, that he would in fact not just claim that he was like Gilgamesh, but he would be a new Gilgamesh. He would be a sage and a warrior all at the same time. So he made these great proclamations. He went to the arena to slay lions. People could watch him do these sorts of things. And the problem when you do this, of course, you see the discrepancy between the ambition and the reality. And what I would say is we don't have evidence for that. It's not in any text that we find, but it seems likely to me that those in this environment must have realized that this king would claim things that were not really within his the
Yeah,
range of.
he overplays his hand a bit, and I think this is always something that's really interesting because it's not that he is singular in the way that perhaps he is not quite as 100% competent as he portrays himself, but instead we do have to take that, and I do think somewhat try to think of like when we how do we apply that to other rulers and their claims about themselves and their claims about their administration, and should we perhaps understand then that this isn't like exceptionally he wasn't exceptionally incompetent, I don't think, but he certainly kind of overplayed who he was, in a way that maybe savvier kings might not have done because they can see perhaps the realpolitik of like, okay, well, don't oversell it. And he doesn't do that. He goes full sell on all of this, and maybe I think there was a genuine interest driving that, because I don't think you go and collect that many tablets unless there is some something behind it from his own motivation. It's hard to say. I think that gets a little bit into, again, psychologizing, but it is interesting to kind of speculate about a bit.
Yeah, and I mean, admittedly, I mean, this is my interpretation of his personality is not something that cannot be questioned. I mean,
Yeah.
this is not in directly in the sources. It's my attempt to understand it, and there might well be others who would see it slightly differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So, how does his reign end? What's going on in the frontiers and the reaches? Like, what's the picture of the empire over the last decade, and what does this leave for his successors?
Yeah, good question. Not easy to answer. What we can see is that from the 640s, we have lots and lots of very long royal inscriptions in which Ashurbanipal describes at great length the successes of his troops and his building activities all over the place. All those things that Assyrian kings would usually dwell on in these self and these auto hagiographies, if you wish. And then, so beginning in 639, there simply are no lengthy inscriptions anymore. So suddenly there isn't anything anymore. And now the question is that the accidents of discovery, it could just be that there were still texts that had been found, or maybe usually those texts would be produced when a new building would be constructed and left in the foundations. Was there not so much building work anymore? And this is why simply no such texts have been found. But it seems more likely that things really began to go wrong. And there's some indirect evidence, for instance, that probably around 640, the Assyrians actually lost control of the western territories of their state. So the Levant, what is now modern Syria, but also Judah, the former kingdom of Israel, etc. This region, this area, Anatolia. It may be that mounted warriors, the Scythians, might have entered that region. The sources really are basically silent. We have a few allusions in Herodotus to, for instance, the Scythians coming along, but of course, Herodotus is not an entirely reliable historical source for these sorts of things.
And in the Bible, for the most part, like in
And the
the Book
Bible
of
is very
Kings, is very silent on
silent.
this. It's
It's
got nothing to say.
yeah, it's very strange. There's this very long, some 50-year long reign of the Judean king Manasseh,
Yeah.
which coincides with Ashurbanipal's reign, but hardly anything is said about him because he's considered a loyal vassal of the Assyrians, and that was not good. He's clearly portrayed as a bad king, but there's also no detail. His
Yeah.
predecessor Hezekiah is a great king because he opposed Sennacherib, even though that was not very successful, and Judah probably suffered from it. But this is just the bias of the depiction of these kings in the sources. And the Babylonian Chronicle is also not preserved, so we know very little, but it does seem as though things are starting to move downhill.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that will, I think, take us into the end of Assyria, because it goes, I mean, not super quick, but it goes, I mean, you describe it as the first world war, as kind of the fallout of this. And I think that this is like such a huge and extended regional conflict that is just, there's so many different moving parts to it. You've got Egypt, you've got the different tribal setups in the south of the Assyrian reaches, and that it's very interesting, and it is this kind of like, I guess that gets into my my question. Was there anyone who could have righted the ship? Like, I know counterfactuals are impossible and probably a mistake. W- Was this inevitable to some extent, that you've got these bulging kind of seams of the empire? They've gone so far to the west. They're deep into Egypt, and they are pot committed there. Like, they are seriously committed. They've never quite made it fully into like Western Turkey. They've tried a couple times. Sargon the Second kind of blew it there. And they keep having these revolts from like their immediate neighbors in Elam and in Babylonia. So I guess the question is, could someone, was Ashurbanipal perhaps the last chance to sort of reform the imperial administration? Is that kind of how you see him? Is like this failure to perhaps reform and maybe modernize, or I don't even know how you do that. Like to be able to manage this sprawling now empire.
Yeah, maybe I just very quickly try to sketch what happens at the end of the
Yeah.
Assyrian Empire. This collapse, as you say, it's not a 1 year thing, but it happens within, let's say, 12 years or so. So it is a pretty dramatic situation scenario. Very unlike the fall of Rome, where no scholar
No one
actually
can agree
on
to
the
it.
date or
Yeah.
so. And I mean, some argue it's still there.
Yeah, I was gonna say Philip K. Dick,
Yeah,
famously the
exactly.
author, said it
So,
never fell, and
so
yeah,
that's not the case with Assyria. The
no,
Assyrian statehood, not necessarily Assyrian culture altogether, but Assyrian statehood is over in 609 at the very latest. And what happens is what we can see is, I mean, there are a number of successors to Ashurbanipal, a certain Ashur-etil-ilani, first son, who's very much in the sway of the chief eunuch, a man by the name of Sinchum-Lisha. This eunuch then becomes, for a short period of 3 months or so, king himself, which is unheard of before, and certainly must have undermined the authority of the royal dynasty to a certain extent. He is then killed and followed by the last real Assyrian king. That's a man by the name of Sinjar Ishkon, who is king at Nineveh from 627 onwards until 612. This is the reign where things really unravel. There are two main opponents of Assyria that bring this defeat of Assyria about. Babylonia, as I already said, of course, taking its revenge for 150 years of humiliation. And the Medes in the east, this confederation, this tribal confederation that, for reasons we still don't fully understand, it may have been in the case of secondary state formation, actually triggered by Assyria, that formed this confederation, and then under the leadership of a man by the name of Cyaxares, that's how the Greeks call him, unite with the Babylonians, and together, beginning essentially with the reign of Sinjar Ishkon, they slowly but steadily encroach upon Assyrian territory. That first, initially from 626 onwards, is a guy, new Babylonian king by the name of Nabopolassar, also initially actually an Assyrian official, so he knows how to deal with the Assyrians. He takes on the crown in Babylon, and then over the next 6 years or so manages to drive the Assyrians out of Babylonia. And then beginning in 616, 615, suddenly he's allied with the Medes,
yeah,
under circumstances that are not clear. And it is especially the Medes, it seems, who then put a lot of pressure suddenly on the Assyrian core area. So the first big and catastrophic blow is in 614, the conquest of this religious capital of Ashur, which is the spiritual heart of Assyria, which is conquered and largely destroyed. And then in 612, the combined troops of the Medes and the Babylonians conquer Nineveh, enter the city after a 3 months-long siege, plunder the palaces, actually hack out the noses, eyes, and ears on these images of the Assyrian kings, of taking revenge for what the Assyrians had done, for instance, in Susa. And there were probably Elamites who were part of this coalition. And then everything is burned down. When you burn down a library, usually, of course, everything is lost. That's why we don't have anything left from Alexandria. The great thing here is, in a way, of course, that this only led to the tablets from Ashurbanipal's libraries being better preserved than they would have been otherwise. But that
that's
was
right.
for the Assyrians, of course.
That's right. We're, I think, now on our like fifth Bible lore podcast collection of texts that have been preserved because everything got burned down. So
Yeah,
thank God for cuneiform on that front.
yes, indeed. I mean, this is a great advantage of cuneiform. But anyway, then there's a short historical coda, a shadowy son of the Sintra Ishko by the name of Ashur-Uballit, that's the throne name he assumes, uh, puts up additional resistance up, but to no avail. In 609, everything is over. This Ashur-Uballit and already Sintra Ishkon had the support of the Egyptians. He may have realized that at this point, suddenly Babylonia rather than Assyria was the greater challenge. So they sided with the Assyrians, but that didn't help Assyria in the end. There are other players involved, the Manians and other eastern people, the Arameans, the Arabs, even Urartu. This is why the term First World War, it was actually first initially used by the archaeologist Karan, but I think it's quite apt. It's really, of course, it's still a world smaller than our modern world, but on this scale, conflict on this scale with so many major players and probably also so much destruction and death was probably rather unprecedented. In the end, Assyria is not able to keep up its statehood. Assyrian writing comes to an end. In Ashur, in particular, some elements of Assyrian religious culture stay in place, but it is a major, major disaster. Could Assyrian kings, starting with Ashurbanipal, have prevented it? I do think we do see kind of a leadership crisis with beginning with Ashurbanipal's reign, especially during the later decades, and that certainly wasn't great under the pressure of these multiple challenges. So I do
Yeah.
think it contributed to the situation. Probably those who did the fighting on behalf of the Assyrian kings were less motivated because those very kings were just remote and relied on their courtiers, no longer really communicated much with the functional elites, the administrative military elites, to the same extent earlier kings had. I cannot answer the question if kings who had been more invested in communicating with these elites would have had a chance to deal with the situation. Could they have adapted in some way? Could they have given up some territory and concentrated on the core areas, defending those? Was the imperial overstretch? I'm not so sure. This is often considered a problem. At some point, an empire no longer expands, then suddenly contracts because it can't really generate the wealth needed to keep it up. But I mean, Rome had its peak in terms of territorial size, I think the mid-second century AD, and it would still go on for quite a while. So I'm not totally convinced.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so there is, I think, it's this combination of factors. Some have also argued that climate change plays a role, and it's indeed true. It's apparently based on a lot of data, scientific data, that rainfall patterns in Assyria in the 7th century were such that was more aridity, there was less rainfall. But the Assyrians had actually compensated quite successfully by building large canal systems to deal with that. So I don't think that really was the decisive factor, but it may have played also a role, especially after the loss of Babylonia, where you have irrigation agriculture. So the agriculture there is less dependent on rainfall than it is in Assyria, which is in the north. I think in the end, it's this combination of factors, and perhaps it was an inevitable thing that Assyria would fall. Um, Alternative scenarios are always possible, which is a question we cannot answer. I
Yep.
mean, what prompts the fall of empires? When it comes to Rome, a German historian, Alexander Demand, has identified 200 reasons established by modern historians for the fall of the Roman Empire. Many of them contradictory. So some say Catholicism, others say Christianity. It can't be both.
Yeah,
So
yeah. The Gibbons and sort of thing. Yeah, absolutely.
indeed, so Gibbons would have been Christianity and so on.
I think Assyria is just so interesting in that regard because, like you mentioned, it's not Rome. You know, it's not centuries of protracted change. It's not. It is so rapid, and everyone seems to get involved. Like Egypt, for example, comes up, but it's not clear that Egypt is exactly, you know, showing up to beg the Assyrians to come back and rule over and them again. You kind of get the impression that they're showing up with their own motivations of, hey, maybe we could pull off what our forefathers didn't and reestablish control over the Levant or some of the
Absolutely.
and there's this kind of like, hey, we could actually negotiate a better deal if we help this flailing Assyrian state to right itself. And maybe perhaps they will be our vassals someday. So it is like it just becomes this vortex and that pulls everything in the area into it. And suddenly Nineveh is surrounded in a lot of ways, and it doesn't seem to put up quite as much of a fight as you might expect from being this big barking dog of empire. So that's I really appreciated your perspective there. I think it's very carefully argued in your book. And I guess wrapping up here, as we're heading into the final stretch, Ashurbanipal, however, kind of gets all of this history pretty quickly gets folded into a a neat story within the cultural memory, and so you get this character that emerges just a couple of hundred years later in Greek, known as Sardanapalus, and suddenly he is the last king of Assyria. And there's this. Can you talk a little bit about this character and kind of his afterlife, because he sticks around a shockingly long amount of time. I think you mentioned some of there's Hollywood pictures from the early 20th century. So this is a character that actually the fact that we're not familiar with him in the most part is actually kind of surprising for the past 2,400 years. So could you talk a bit about him?
Yeah, Ashurbanipal's afterlife is actually really quite fascinating. You're absolutely right. He's presented in this Greek tradition that probably goes back to the time around 400 BCE. He's presented as the last king of Syria. His name is rendered as Sardanapalus, and you can so see that the name Ashurbanipal is behind it. Of course, Ashurbanipal wasn't the last Assyrian king, but he was the last great Assyrian king. And for the purpose of making the story dramatically more appealing, those who told it first just simply then said, okay, he is in fact the guy under whom the Assyrian Empire collapsed. This is the premise of the whole thing. Um, the main source for the story is a Greek historian by the name of Theseus, who lived around 400 BCE and apparently served as the court physician of a Persian king by the name of Artaxerxes at that very time. And he seems to have heard these stories about Ashurbanipal Sardanapalus from the Persians. May initially have been a Persian tradition. There's some debate about whether this guy really was the physician there or not, but it seems quite possible. What does this story was then handed down that Theseus and was preserved, especially in the historical works of a Roman historian by the name of Diodorus Siculus, and his work has been preserved to a large extent, and the whole story of Sardanapalus is known from there, but it's also known from other Greek and Roman historians. So this is not the only version. It seems to have been very influential. There's a lot of stuff that's been said about him. And the basic outline of the story is that there's an interest in the Greek world for the very first and the very last Assyrian rulers. The very first is a king by the name of Ninus, and especially his very colorful wife Semiramis. I could say a lot about her. So a woman, child, sort of credited with the birth of the Assyrian Empire. Very interesting, but that's not for this podcast. The last king is the Sardanapalus. So the first king, of course, and his wife, they're very vigorous, they're very, very powerful, and they're courageous, they go on military campaigns. This is how they create the empire. The last king, Sardanapalus, is the opposite. He's kind of a stereotype. So he's portrayed as a weakling, in line with Greek's ideal of masculinity. He's considered effeminate, having sexual relations with men and women, sticking at home in his palace with his concubines and eunuchs, making wool, purple wool, and things like that. Very, very unroyal behavior. And then the story is that a Babylonian by the name of Belesys and a Mede by the name of Arbaces. The names are not historical, it's not the correct names, they're actually names from the 5th century BCE. But what is correct is that the Babylonians and Medes are referenced here. They engage in a coalition, and eventually, because they realize this Assyrian state that is so predominant here is weak, we can actually take it over. And this is what happens then. The Medes in particular, with the help of this Belesys, the Babylonian, they seize the city of Nineveh, where Ashurbanipal Sardanapalus is residing. Sardanapalus realizes this is happening. He builds a gigantic funerary pyre, boxes in his concubines and all his wealth, and himself he puts on top of the whole thing, and then he lightens this thing and everything goes up in flames. So immolation. Nineveh disappears in an orgy of destruction and flames, and that's the end of the story of the Sardanapalus.
Yeah.
So in many ways, of course, you could say this is a typical example of Orientalism in the Greek tradition, an attempt to engage in an act of othering, presenting the East as the opposite of Greek virtue and freedom and all these things that the Greeks consider for themselves to be their main marks. And that is not wrong. I mean, obviously, it is not the story of Assyria as it really happened. That is very important to point out.
It's very moralizing and
Indeed,
kind
it's
of like
moralizing.
I mean they love doing that,
There's a
again
whole genderizing
they
and
would
all
do
that.
it to them, to their own kings and emperors and things like
Yes,
that as well.
absolutely.
But
Yeah.
it takes a different flavor when it is, like you said, in orientalizing
Yeah,
perspective.
in this Oriental environment, it's kind of more disgusting, if you wish, and
Yeah.
that's important always to keep in mind. There's an agenda here, but I would also say, I mean, after what I've just been saying about Ashurbanipal and him being the model for the Sardanapalus, then of course you do also there are certain things that resonate.
Yeah.
Ashurbanipal staying in his palace. I mean, this is what he really did. It's not that he was a great warrior, even though he presents himself as such. So this clearly is something where the two traditions seem to be quite similar, or rather history and tradition seem to be similar. And maybe the most impressive historical resonance of these Greek stories about Sardanapalus is another story that's actually not Theseus, but in some other authors who write about the funerary monument that allegedly Sardanapalus had erected in Cilicia in Anatolia. And according to this story, some generals of Alexander had seen this monument while on their campaign with Alexander to the east. What they say about it is it showed Syrian king Sardanapalus allegedly sort of an act of snipping his fingers, and that is actually how Assyrian kings often look like on Assyrian orthostats. And then they claim there was an inscription added to this image where the king spoke and said, so speaking to posterity, "Eat, drink, and make merry. The rest is not more worth than this," with this meaning the snapping of the finger. So a hedonist statement presenting the Sardanapalus as the arch hedonist, which is very much in line, of course, with this episode that I mentioned earlier about this seer who had been approached by the goddess Ishtar, who had said to Ashurbanipal, "Eat, drink, and make merry, and I will go to war and deal with this." And this is so similar that I find it hard to believe that it is not related in some way. So I do believe that there were traditions from the reign of Ashurbanipal presenting him already in this kind of weak light of someone who would indulge in good food and other sort of pleasurable activities, but not necessarily
Right. And
ask
it is
rule as
again, it's very interesting how you see that the whole eat, drink, and be merry for tomorrow we die is it also ends up in the biblical texts as well as kind of this. I think it's applied to the Babylonians because that's obviously, despite all the trauma of Assyria, the Babylonians end up being the big bad of the Bible in a lot of ways. Um, and it's very again, I think you're right there. Like there does seem to have been a fairly quick resonance of this story, and like the traditions probably developed not too long after the destruction of Assyria. Like the people would be looking back and saying, you know, what the hell just happened over these last couple of decades? A lot goes on and a lot goes wrong, and like the entire picture of the political outlay of the Middle East shifts in truly monumental ways. And at the center of it is this guy, our pal Sardanapalus. And I think again, you talk about like there's plays, like he ends up in. I was it Milton or Dante.
yeah, in various connections. I
Like
mean, uh,
Sardanapalus has this
mm,
really long lifespan as this cultural
yes,
character.
yes, he's in the Middle Ages. He's considered the inventor of the feather bed,
Yeah,
right?
there it is.
The Pluma Sardanapali, which is mentioned by Roman poets. There's erotic poetry from early modernity in England that features him sort of as an early paragon of a more libertine age. So there he is endorsed. There's actually a statue from Rome, which is basically a depiction of the god Dionysos, Bacchus, the god of wine and merriment, but it's inscribed with the name of Sardanapalus. So someone identified this guy with this god with Sardanapalus. So yes, he remained a very important figure, usually reviled. Usually, of course, he was considered a flawed example, and you can imagine that in in the Christian Middle Ages in particular, he was the opposite of a role model. He was a negative role model, and especially the sexual deviations, as it was considered, are referenced in Dante's Divina Commedia, for example. So you have it all over the place, well into the 19th century, when Lord Byron wrote a whole drama about Sardanapalus. Goethe refers to him in his Faust. There's a cantata about him. So all sorts of references. He was a fascinating figure. Perhaps also the crossing of boundaries between male and female and all that. So it has lost some of its luster since the discovery of the real Ashurbanipal. And initially there was then just simply this idea, okay, this Greek story is just completely fictitious and nothing to do with reality. We can ignore it. But I would say maybe not, and we should look at these stories really. On one hand for their entertainment value, but also because they really do teach us something about the perception of other civilizations, and it's entertaining in its first place as
Yeah,
well.
no, absolutely. And I think the potential ties between the conflagration at the end that kills him and the real conflagration that killed his brother in Babylon is, again, it makes it, I think, more enriching to understand how our culture has kind of accreted all of these things on it based on like later reception and then reception of that reception, and it just kind of keeps
Right.
rolling, and like it sort of snowballs and collects all of this stuff onto itself. And yeah, that was I think just a delightful part of your book. And yeah, I guess there, do you have anything else you wanted to talk about for Ashurbanipal, Assyria, or Sardanapalus before we wrap up here?
No, I think it's been long, and I
Yeah.
think I said my spiel. So I mean, thank you very much. I do
Yeah.
think, the past is not past, is not even dead. That applies. I think when you think about Ashurbanipal, this later reception, it is a story that tells you something even today about relations between East and West that continue to be charged, where a lot of complex thinking is going on. It's good to see the roots of some of this, I think. Both as it actually happened and how later on it was distorted but distorted in ways drawing on actual events. I think it is important to think about this history today, but it is not just a didactic thing, but I think it's worth dealing with this and reading about it, simply also because it's kind of fun. I think that's
Yeah.
what is important to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And I think that is just a key part of your book, Assyria, The Rise and Fall of the World's First Empire. I had a lot of fun with it. There are a lot of the books that I've recommended on this show that can be more like textbooks or reading like introductory works. And yeah, Dr. Fromm's book is not that. It is an absolute like banger from start to finish. It is really, really good. So please check it out. It's just one of those books that I think is written for anyone can read it. It's yeah, really, really, really great. So absolutely phenomenal getting to chat with you about your wonderful book. Do you have anything else to plug,
Do you have anything else to?
promote, or plug?
No, no, I don't want to promote anything. You have promoted my book so nicely. That's very generous. I really appreciate it. I think it would be too obstinately modest if I promoted anything else. This was great. I really enjoyed it, and I was impressed by the background you have, and you clearly know this period very well yourself. And I look forward to listening to your podcast in the future.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And for everyone back at home, check out the book. Make sure to become a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/Bible or podcast to support the show and get access to hours of additional bonus content like this. And I will see you next time on the Bible or podcast.
Then I can write a shopping list in classical Sumerian and tell you whether peoples were nomadic or agrarian. I know the Jewish festivals Purimic and Kippurian. I'm humble in Medaic, I can hum a little Hurrian. Then I can sing the alphabet in hieroglyphic Luvian and catalog the animals pre and post-Diluvian. Then I can tell the subs from a Cheshire bull or maniple and reconstruct the library of ancient Assurbanipal. 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 I wrote my dissertation in a flowery Akkadian and proved the Philistines were almost certainly Canadian. In short, it is lexical, semantic, and homologous. I am the very model of a biblical philologist. In short, it is lexical, semantic, and homologous. He is the very model of a biblical